it is a room without windows. Somewhere inside a building in Moscow, whose address does not appear on any map the public is allowed to see, on a cold morning in the early spring of 1988, there is a drain set into the floor. There is a single bare bulb. The walls are painted a dark, practical color, the kind of color a man chooses when he does not want stains to show. Two guards bring in a third man, an old man, 66 years old, broad in the shoulders even now, a man who once carried wounded soldiers out of artillery fire and was decorated for it by the same country that has brought him to this room. They tell him to kneel. He knows this procedure. He has spent his whole life inside the service that is about to carry it out, and he understands exactly what happens next. No last words that anyone will keep. No priest, no grave with a name on it. In the private language of his own service, there is even a phrase for it. Vysshaya mera, the highest measure of punishment. He lowers himself onto the concrete. Behind him, a man lifts a pistol to the back of his skull. And the thing you need to understand, before we go one step further, is that this old man on his knees was the single most valuable spy the United States of America ever had. And the men about to kill him were his own. For nearly 20 years, he handed the Americans the deepest secrets the Soviet Union possessed. He never took real money for any of it. He asked instead for fishing tackle, for a hand drill. And two men, two Americans, whose entire job was to keep him alive, sold his name for cash. You're listening to the Betrayal Files. The folder is thin, for a man who gave away so much.
That is because almost everything he handed over is still locked in a vault and will be for the rest of your life. Case file number 6, declassified only in fragments, through the memoirs of the CIA officers who ran him, through the damage assessments of the two traitors who betrayed him, and through a few cold lines printed in the Soviet newspaper Pravda in January of 1990, nearly 2 years after he was already dead. His real file, the briefing transcripts, the photographs of stolen documents, is said to fill 25 drawers in the innermost archive of the Central Intelligence Agency. Most of it you will never see. The country is the Soviet Union. The service is the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence, the older, quieter, more secretive twin of the KGB. The era is the Cold War at its very coldest. And the man on the folder is not a defector who ran, not a clerk who pocketed a few pages. He was a general. His name was Dmitri Polyakov. The Americans called him the jewel in the crown. Moscow, in the end, called him something you do not say out loud. He was born on the 6th of July, 1921, in a quiet town in the Ukrainian countryside, the son of a bookkeeper, a family of ledgers and small, careful sums, of people whose whole trade was counting things and making them balance. He was a serious boy, good with his hands, the kind who could take a broken clock apart on the kitchen table and have it running again by supper. He grew up in the young Soviet Union, believing, as a boy is taught to believe, in the country all around him. Then came the war. When Germany invaded in 1941, Dmitri Polyakov went into the artillery, and he was good at it, and he was brave in the way that earns a man medals and gets the men standing next to him killed in the same gray afternoon. He commanded guns at the front. He carried the wounded out of the fire with his own arms. He watched an entire generation of his friends go into the frozen ground. By the end of it, his chest carried decorations from a grateful Soviet state, and his memory carried something much heavier than no medal ever balanced out. He came home a hero, and heroes, in Stalin's Soviet Union, were noticed. In 1951, they brought him into the GRU, and the careful boy who fixed clocks became an officer inside the most secret machine his country owned. They trained him, they tested him, and then they sent him, of all the places on earth, to New York to sit on the military staff committee of the young United Nations. A Soviet officer in a heavy overcoat,
walking the same bright Manhattan streets as the enemy he had been built to fight. He was, by every account of the men who later sat across from him, an impressive human being. Barrel-chested, calm, a weekend carpenter who loved fine shotguns and still water and the long patience of fishing. He drank little, he smoked little, he was faithful to his wife and devoted to his sons. The kind of man who wanted, far more than rank or ribbons, simply to see his children educated, settled, and safe. Hold on to that. The carpentry, the shotguns, the sons. Everything this man would one day ask for in exchange for the crown jewels of his country tells you precisely who he was. And then, by several accounts of this case, came the wound that never closed. The story, and it is one the people who studied him came to believe, though the Soviet state never confirmed a single word of it, is that while he was posted in New York, one of his young sons fell gravely ill. The boy needed treatment, and there, in the city all around them, was some of the finest medicine in the world. So Polyakov, the loyal officer, went to his superiors, and he asked for the permission and the money to save his own child. And Moscow said, no, it was too expensive. It did not look right for a Soviet officer to beg for Western doctors. The boy did not live. Whether that is the whole truth or only a part of it, something in Dmitri Polyakov shifted in those years, and it never shifted back. He looked at the country he had bled for, the medals, the speeches, the endless talk of the workers' paradise, and then he looked at what was actually in front of his eyes, the corruption, the lies, the men at the top who lived like czars while the system ground up everyone beneath them. One of the CIA officers who came to know him said it plainly. He said Polyakov set the horror and the carnage of the things he had fought for against the duplicity and the corruption he watched spreading through Moscow, and he could not make them balance. But here is the thing that people get wrong about him over and over again. He did not become a man who hated Russia. He became the opposite, a man convinced he was one of the last people left who truly loved it. He would say it himself, later, in words the Americans who heard them never forgot. "I am not doing this for you," he told them. "I am doing this for my country. I was born a Russian, and I will die a Russian." But to save the Russia he loved, as he understood it, he was going to have to betray the Soviet Union that flew the flag over it. And in 1961, back in New York for a second tour, a senior officer of Soviet military intelligence stepped quietly out of the crowd, walked up to the Americans, and offered them everything he had. He made his approach not to the CIA, but to the FBI, to the Americans on their own soil, in their own city. There was no drama to it, no film, no dead drop in the dark. A high Soviet officer simply let it be known that he was willing to talk. And then he began, calmly, to hand over what he knew. The Americans could not believe their luck, and then they could not stop being afraid of it. A source this high, this deep inside the enemy, is as terrifying as he is precious. If he was real, he was the most important man they had ever touched in their lives. If he was a trap, he could burn them to the ground. So they gave him two names, the way they name all their ghosts. The FBI called him Top Hat. The CIA called him Bourbon. But to the handful of officers who actually ran him over the years, he became something simpler than a code name. He became the General. And now the first thing that makes him almost impossible to believe. He would not take their money. Understand how strange that is in this world. Every other spy in this whole story, on every side, was bought. Aldrich Ames would one day sell his people to Moscow for $2.5 million. Robert Hanssen would take cash and diamonds worth close to $1.5 million. But Dmitri Polyakov, the general who gave away more than either of those men ever dreamed of putting their hands on, set his own price at no more than $3,000 a year. And even that he did not want in cash. He asked to be paid in Black & Decker power tools,
in fishing gear, in hunting shotguns, and a pair of work overalls. He asked for cheap cigarette lighters and pens by the fistful, little trinkets, which he then carried back inside and handed out to the other officers of the GRU, buying their goodwill with gifts from the very enemy he was serving. The most valuable spy of the entire Cold War invoiced the most powerful intelligence service on Earth for a drill and a rod. And because he refused to run, because he insisted always on staying inside, at his desk, in his uniform, where the secrets were, the Americans had to invent a way to talk to a man who lived in the very belly of the beast. What they built with him is still studied by their trade today. In Moscow, he stole, out of the GRU's own supply cupboard, a special self-destructing film that could only be developed with a secret chemical he and his handlers shared, so that if the KGB ever seized a roll and processed it the ordinary way, it would come out blank, black, empty. He photographed classified documents with it by the hundred. He hid the little cartridges inside hollow, fake stones and left them lying in meadows outside the city for the Americans to quietly collect. He rode the streetcar. That was one of his signals. A senior officer of the Soviet Army riding a public tram past the United States Embassy with a miniature burst transmitter buried in his coat pocket, thumbing a hidden button as he rolled past to squirt a coded message across the street in a burst that lasted 2.5 seconds, and was gone before any listening post could even turn its head. The CIA's technicians built that device by hand for him alone. Type the message, encrypt it, one press of a button, 2.5 seconds. Nothing. And when the GRU posted him abroad, because they kept promoting him up and up to Burma and then to India, he met his handlers in the back alleys of Rangoon and among the tall reeds along the Yamuna River in New Delhi. Picture that. An aging Soviet officer crouched in the bulrushes of a foreign city at dusk, handing his country's most guarded secrets to the enemy, and then going home to have dinner with his family, as though the day had held nothing at all. Now understand what was actually on that film, what was hidden in those stones and fired across the street in those 2.5-second bursts. It was, quite simply, the Soviet Union itself. He gave the Americans the secret of the split between the Soviet Union and Communist China. Hard, documentary proof that the two great communist powers privately despised one another, that the West was not facing one vast enemy, but two that hated each other. And a president named Richard Nixon, with his advisor Henry Kissinger, took exactly that knowledge and used it to drive a wedge between them, to open the door to China in 1972 and bend the shape of the entire century. That opening began, in part, with a Soviet officer crouched in the reeds of a river in Delhi. He gave up more than 100 issues of the Soviet General Staff's most secret strategic journal, a publication so classified that simply reading it told the Americans how the men who commanded the Soviet war machine truly spoke to one another, when they believed no outsider would ever hear. And what those stolen pages revealed was, of all things, a kind of mercy. They showed that the Soviet generals were not the frothing madmen Washington had feared. They were, in the words of one CIA director who read them, as frightened of a nuclear war as the Americans were. In the most dangerous decades in human history, this one quiet traitor told each side, in secret, that the other did not actually want the world to end. He handed over the technical secrets of Soviet anti-tank missiles, cold engineering data that would sit in an American vault for years, and then, in 1991, help American forces tear apart Soviet-built armor in the deserts of Iraq, a full generation after he himself was dead. He gave up a shopping list, inches thick, of every piece of Western technology that Soviet spies had been ordered to go out and steal. Thousands upon thousands of separate programs, an entire secret map of how the Soviet Union was trying to build its future out of stolen Western parts. And he gave up people,
American investigators later credited him with helping to expose a string of Westerners secretly working for Moscow. Among them, a man buried inside the American National Security Agency and a scientist in Britain.
Men who believed themselves perfectly safe were marched into prison cells because a Soviet officer on the far side of the planet had quietly written their secret down on self-destructing film. By the time it was finished, the record of what he gave filled 25 deep drawers in the most secret archive the CIA owns. The director of the agency called him the jewel in the crown and said flatly that what Polyakov did for the West did not merely help win the Cold War. It helped keep the Cold War from ever turning hot. And the men and women who ran him said the thing they could never quite get past was not the sheer volume of it, and not even the risk. It was that he would not stop, he would not run, he would not take the money. Year after year, he simply walked back inside the machine that would one day kill him and kept going, for nothing but the thing he believed. And every single day of all of it, he was one small mistake away from the room with the drain in the floor. A burst transmission that hung a half-second too long, a fake stone lifted by the wrong pair of hands. A colleague who wondered, idly, why the general was quite so generous with foreign pens. He walked that knife edge for the better part of 20 years and never once slipped. The people who finally killed him did not catch him, they were told. In the summer of 1980, Moscow ordered Dmitri Polyakov home. On the face of it, it was nothing at all. He was nearly 60, a general at the natural end of a long career, quietly due for retirement. But he had spent his whole life reading the fine print of his own service, and something in that recall frightened him to the bone. His American handlers, who loved him about as much as men in that trade ever allow themselves to love anyone, offered him the only gift they had. "Come out," they told him. "Bring your wife, your sons. We will make you safe. We will give you a whole new life." He said no. "Don't wait for me," he told them quietly in Russian. "I am never going to the United States." And then he said the thing that the men in that room carried with them for the rest of their lives. That if it ever came to it, what waited for him at home was Bratskaya Mogila, a common grave, an unmarked pit with no name on it. He stood there and told them in plain words, more or less exactly how his story was going to end. And then he got on the plane, and he flew home to Russia anyway. Because he had never once lied to them about the only thing that mattered. He had never done any of it for them. And for a few years, nothing happened. He retired. He worked in his garden. He went fishing on quiet water. The most damaging spy in the history of the Soviet Union became a broad-shouldered old general in a Moscow suburb, and the terrible secret he carried simply went to sleep inside him. And then, far away, in the offices of the two American agencies he had served so faithfully for so long, two other men sat down and did the exact thing he had never done. They did it for money. The first was a rising officer inside the FBI named Robert Hanssen, a man who has his own thick folder in these files. As early as 1979 and 1980, in his very first season as a traitor, Hanssen reached out to the GRU and sold them pieces of what the Americans knew. And among those pieces, by the accounts that came out much later, was the shape of a high Soviet source, a general, feeding the enemy from the inside. It was not yet a name. It was only a loose thread. But it was pulled free, and it was left hanging in the dark, years before anybody paid for it. The second man finished what the first had started. In 1985, the year American intelligence would come to call the Year of the Spy, a CIA officer named Aldrich Ames walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington and, for cash, began selling the identities of every single Soviet who was secretly working for the United States. He sold, by the count that followed, around 10 men to their deaths.
And the most valuable name on that list? The crown jewel, the general. The man who took his wages in power tools was Dmitri Polyakov. Ames gave him to the KGB for money in 1985, and still, for a while, nothing seemed to move. Because Polyakov was already retired, already quiet, already an old man in a garden. So the KGB took its time. It watched. It confirmed. It closed every road out, one by one, before it ever let him feel the walls. They came for him in 1986, 6 years after he had flown home to wait for precisely this. There was no chase, no siege. There rarely is for a man who always knew. They took the old general quietly, and they carried him into the machine he had spent his entire life inside. And they began, in that machine's patient and terrible way, to ask him to account for 20 years of a double life. What he told them in that place we do not fully know, and probably never will. What we know is that it took them the better part of 2 years, the interrogations, the confrontation with the evidence that 2 Americans had sold them, the slow, cold accounting of everything he had ever given away. And on the 15th of March, 1988, they walked Dmitri Polyakov into a room without windows, and they told him to kneel, and they shot him in the back of the head. He was 66 years old. The state that had pinned medals on his chest for his courage killed him in a basement for his conscience, and it did not breathe a word of it to anyone. No public trial, no grave the world could find. Nearly 2 years later, in January of 1990, a few flat lines appeared in Pravda, admitting that a general had been executed for treason. And that was the very first the world was permitted to know that the jewel in the crown was gone. The 2 men who sold him did not pay for it for a long time. Aldrich Ames drove a Jaguar and bought a $500,000 house with cash on a government salary, and no one at the CIA thought to ask how, until at last they arrested him in 1994 and gave him life without the possibility of parole. Robert Hanssen taped his final package under a footbridge in a Virginia park and was taken down in the wet leaves in February of 2001. Then, buried alive in a concrete cell until he died inside it in 2023. Both men, in the end, got the years and the reckoning that Polyakov never did. Both of them, in their own way, already sit in these files. But the man they sold got nothing. No pension for the family, no hero's return, not even in secret. In the Soviet Union, his name became a thing you did not say. A general erased. A traitor unpersoned. His relatives left to live out their lives beneath the shadow of what he had done, without ever being told enough to truly understand it. Everything he had wanted for his sons, the education, the safety, the quiet professional life, died with him in that windowless room. He had spent 20 years and finally his own life, trying to buy a future for his children, and the bill for all of it was handed to them. In America, they did what little they could, which was almost nothing at all, because he himself had made them promise it. You cannot save a man who refuses to be saved. So they kept him the only way that was left to them, 25 drawers of him, sealed in the deepest vault they own, his briefings, his photographs of stolen secrets, the whole paper skeleton of the best source American intelligence has ever admitted to running. A complete secret life, filed and locked, in the archive of the enemy he chose. For years, the argument went back and forth over which of the 2 traitors truly killed him, whether it was Hanssen's loose thread in 1980 or Ames's cold sale in 1985. The honest answer is the cruelest one available. It took both of them, 2 Americans in 2 different buildings, neither one aware the other so much as existed, reaching across the very same years to hand the very same man to the very same executioner. He trusted the service that killed him, and he trusted the service that sold him. And both of those trusts were paid back in exactly the same coin. So much of this was never answered. These are the questions the file leaves lying open on the desk. First, was it really the death of his son?
The story of the sick boy in New York and the permission Moscow refused has trailed this case for decades, and it would explain almost everything. But the Soviet state never confirmed one word of it, and Polyakov himself, who spoke so readily of duty and corruption, almost never spoke of grief. Did a father cross that line for his country, the way he always swore he had? Or, for one small grave the world was never allowed to count? Second, why would he not come out? They offered him safety, a new life, his family beside him, again and again across 20 years. And every single time he chose to stay with the country he knew, in his bones, would one day make him kneel on a concrete floor. Was it love? Was it pride? Or had he decided, somewhere along the way, that a man simply is the thing he refuses to run from? Third, how much of what the West believed about the Soviet mind came from him alone? He handed over the secret journals that told Washington the enemy was frightened, not mad, and that one reassurance may quietly have shaped a dozen decisions in the most dangerous years the species has ever lived through. How much of the peace we like to imagine we kept was actually kept by one man hiding in the reeds of a foreign river? Fourth, how did the whisper hang in the air for 6 long years?
If a thread pointing straight at a high Soviet general was pulled loose as early as 1980, why did it take all the way until 1986 to close around his throat? Was the old man shielded, for a time, by the very confusion the two traitors created, each one's lies muddying the trail of the other so that neither could quite be seen? Fifth, and this last one is not a question because the file has already answered it, Dmitri Polyakov was, by any measure the trade uses, the greatest spy that either side produced in the whole of the Cold War. And he asked to be paid in a fishing rod. The two men who betrayed him wanted mansions and sports cars and to be told endlessly how clever they were. He wanted only to be right about his country, and being right about his country is the exact thing that put him on his knees. Close the folder. A boy from a family of bookkeepers who grew up and learned to count the true cost of the country he loved. A decorated war hero, the state pinned with medals, and then shot in a basement. A general who held the deepest secrets the Soviet Union possessed in the palm of his hand and gave every one of them away. Not for money, not for revenge, but because he had decided somewhere in the carnage that loving Russia and serving the men who ruled it were two entirely different things, and that he could only do one of them. He was paid in power tools. He was sold by two men who wanted to be paid in gold. He flew home to die when he could have lived, because he had told the plain truth from the very first day, that he never once did it for them. His own country dropped him into an unmarked grave and said nothing for 2 years. His enemy kept him in 25 drawers and called him the best they ever had. The jewel in the crown, betrayed in the end by both of the crowns he stood between. Case closed.